Hey there, and welcome to Bedtime History. If you're just settling in, grab a blanket, fluff up your pillow, and let the outside world drift away for a little while. You're in exactly the right place if you're looking for a quiet escape, somewhere between history's forgotten corners, whispered myths, and the kind of stories that feel like lullabies for your mind. I'm Kai, and I am your host for tonight at the Bedtime History. Let's wind together the roads of ancient tales, dusty manuscripts, and half-remembered legends, and turn them into something soft enough to fall asleep to. No rush, no noise, just slow, soothing storytelling under the stars of your imagination. So dim the lights, maybe leave a fan running for that gentle background hum, and let's begin tonight's journey together. Because history doesn't always have to be loud to be unforgettable. Sweet dreams, and thank you for being here. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're still awake enough to find your keyboard, tell me where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is right now where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You lie there, your cheek brushing gently against a pillow, soft, quiet, a little cooler than the room. And just like that, you're already halfway back in time, without even realizing it. Because if you were sleeping in a Victorian home, say somewhere between 1840 and 1890, the pillow beneath your head might be a tapestry of miniature secrets. Silk threads stitched by hands long gone. A small cushion, yes, but one layered with the language of love, grief, humor, duty, and possibly a cat in a bonnet. The Victorians didn't do anything halfway. If it could be written, it could be carved. If it could be carved, it could be painted. And if it could be painted, it might as well be embroidered onto a pillow. Decorative pillows, especially those found in parlors and sitting rooms, became canvas and code. And you didn't just toss one on a settee without intention. Pillow embroidery was a form of soft power. A way to broadcast your moral purity, your literacy, your patriotism, your wry wit, or your passive-aggressive feelings toward your house guests, all without saying a single word. Imagine walking into a parlor and seeing a hand-stitched pillow that read, in elaborate cursive threadwork, "She who gossips sows her own undoing." You're not just sitting on a couch, you're sitting inside a conversation that started before you got there. That's where we begin tonight, on a well-fluffed pillow, yes, but also at a curious crossroads. The world of Victorian embroidery sits somewhere between art and domestic duty, between industry and intimacy. It's a realm woven from contradiction, demure but loud, decorative but pointed, relaxing but relentlessly detail-obsessed. Most of these embroidered pillows were made by women, often as part of domestic arts education. But don't get too comfortable thinking this was all proper and polite. No. These weren't just flowery samplers about butter churning and Bible verses. Some of them were coded love letters. Some were politically sharp, some morbidly funny, and some, let's be honest, were embroidered while someone was extremely annoyed at their sister-in-law. Now, before you envision an endless parade of pale floral borders and frilly lettering, let me stop you right there. Pillow embroidery was not one thing. It was many things stitched together under candlelight. Sure, you had your moral sayings, your idle hands are the devil's playthings sort of fluff, but you also had things like, the road to a man's heart lies through his tea tray, or the more mysterious, when roses fade, will she remain? And just when you think the Victorians were being all mystical and symbolic, you find a pillow with a goose in trousers dancing next to a smiling teacup. They were weird, and we love them for it. One well-known fact: embroidery during this time exploded in popularity due to the rise of the middle class and the expansion of mass-produced threads. A formerly elite craft became a widespread hobby, helped along by pattern books, needlework magazines, and the fact that doing something with your hands while silently enduring family dinners was, frankly, a survival skill. But here's a lesser-known curiosity. Many embroidery patterns were distributed as cigarette cards. Yes, really. Tobacco companies included small paper guides for pillow designs inside cigarette boxes. intended for the lady of the house. Because nothing says family bonding quite like your husband's smoking habit giving you a guide to stitch an eagle carrying a harp. And then, of course, there's the eternal scholarly debate. Was Victorian pillow embroidery a genuine outlet for female expression, or just another form of enforced domesticity wrapped in silk thread? Some say it was liberation through beauty. Others argue it was the prettiest shackle ever stitched. Historians still go back and forth on this, some even changing their position based on whether they've had tea that day. You reach out and run your fingers along the imaginary threads. They're textured, raised, just slightly rough where satin stitch meets crosshatch. You can almost hear the ticking of a mantel clock, the clink of porcelain teacups, the barely audible sigh of someone carefully deciding whether to stitch a violet or a viper. Because, yes, snakes were popular too. The pillow beneath you tonight may be modern, stuffed with memory foam or synthetic down, but now you know it's got a legacy. Once upon a time, a simple square of linen held an entire inner life. It spoke when the room was silent. It comforted, protested, hinted, laughed, and mourned. And just think, if you'd lived back then, you might have had to embroider a pillow just to get a date. Because nothing says marry me like 78 hours of perfectly aligned French not spelling out faith, hope, and fortitude. Don't worry. You probably wouldn't have survived Victorian embroidery school anyway. The needles were sharp, the instructors terrifying, and the expectation to monogram everything, including socks, would have broken your spirit before your thimble. But for now, you just drift. Thread by thread, stitch by stitch, soft, steady, silent. You're still lying there, comfortably tucked into the soft hush of the evening. But now your mind begins to drift sideways, towards something stitched in secret. A pillow, yes, but this one's different. This one doesn't rest so much as sigh. It carries no slogan about virtue, no cross-stitched cat, no peonies in pastel. Instead, it tells a love story, one that never quite got permission to be spoken aloud. Victorian society, bless it and blame it, was not particularly fond of people saying what they meant, especially if what they meant was "I want to kiss you in the garden" during Aunt Matilda's tedious sermon. So they found another way. They embroidered it. You reach out in your imagination and turn over one of those old satin pillows resting on a hand-carved chaise longue. The front might be all lilies and scrollwork, but underneath, there's a heart stitched into the lining, or an initial tucked beside a flower that only one person would understand. A secret message encoded in thread. Pillow talk before electricity. Literally, this is the pillow of courtship, of longing disguised as lace, of flirtation passed through the eye of a needle. Young women, especially those in the rising middle class, were expected to master the arts of gentility, which included embroidery, piano, knowing just enough French to get through a dinner party, and the subtle act of pouring tea without declaring your undying affection. So naturally, those affections had to go somewhere else. Somewhere safe. Somewhere soft. Sometimes a suitor might receive a cushion stitched with wild violets, symbolizing modesty, or marigolds, hinting at desire. One pillow even found in a Norwich museum bears the phrase, "Ever in silence, my heart is thine," which is just the Victorian equivalent of, "I like you, but my dad's in the next room, and also society is terrifying." And here's the kicker. Many of these romantic messages weren't exchanged directly. They were left in parlors, positioned just so. A pillow turned face down on the left side of a chaise? That might mean, "I'm ready to talk." A pillow with a tassel twisted 3 times? That might mean, "Meet me by the gate after Vespers." There was an entire nonverbal language of cushion placement, like a cozy version of naval semaphore. One well-known fact, the language of flowers was wildly popular in the Victorian period. Entire guidebooks cataloged the meanings of different blooms. But lesser known was the language of textiles, where colors, stitches, and materials carried significance. Red silk meant passion. Pale blue signified constancy. A half-finished embroidery piece left on display might suggest the stitcher's own unsettled emotions. or just that she was tired and had a headache. Historians still argue. They also debate the role of these pillow messages in class boundaries. For wealthier women, embroidery was leisurely self-expression, maybe with a scandalous wink if the governess wasn't looking. For lower-class women, stitching a cushion was sometimes a way to signal their domestic skill and emotional literacy to potential employers or lovers without ever saying a word. You imagine someone tracing a single rose onto muslin. The lines are faint. They'll be stitched in pale pink later, shaded with tiny feather stitches that take hours. But for now, it's just a ghost of affection. A whisper waiting to be sown. In a world without text messages, voice notes, emojis, or dramatic Instagram reels, this was how they told someone you matter. In silence, with thread. Now here's a little quirky detail. Some embroidery circles, notably in parts of rural Wales and the north of England, had a peculiar custom. Once a courtship was underway, a young woman would embroider a cushion cover featuring a riddle or pun involving the suitor's profession. One example: "He who bakes, my heart he takes," which sounds sweet until you realize the poor baker now had to respond in kind, and he wasn't exactly practiced in rhyming verse. Some of those returned cushions were painfully earnest. One famously awkward example: "Your bobbin winds the spool of fate. Marry me before it's late." Historians aren't sure whether she said yes. You picture that moment. Two people sitting across from each other in a parlor, 5 feet apart, a chaperone in the corner snoring quietly, and a cushion on the armchair between them, decorated with ivy, the symbol of fidelity. It says nothing. It says everything. She embroidered it herself. He tries not to look too directly. They drink lukewarm tea in silence. You smile a little. It's absurd. It's beautiful. You think about how different love looks now. How loud it is, how fast, how digital. But something about this old pillow, a simple square of thread and longing, feels more human, more grounded. You can't swipe past it. You can't fast forward. You just trace the threads. And yes, maybe you're imagining someone putting a little too much emotion into a buttonhole stitch, their fingers trembling slightly, their needles slipping. Embroidery was unforgiving. No undo key. But maybe that made every detail more intentional, more careful. Like love, when you can't say it aloud. You drift a bit deeper now. The air around you softens. The edges blur. You're lying on a pillow that once might have meant everything to someone. Or nothing at all. And maybe that's okay. Because even unrequited stitches still held the warmth of hands that tried. And so you sleep, surrounded by stories woven in silence. Little knots of hope. Little petals of patience. Little threads of love. You're still nestled in that quiet place, where thread hums like memory and the fabric of history feels soft against your thoughts. But tonight, your journey takes a slightly chaotic turn, because believe it or not, there was once an actual embroidery panic. Yes, a real one. Fueled not by war or famine, but by decorative pillows. Welcome to the year 1854, a time of starch, lace, and surprisingly high anxiety over the direction of needlework. You may not have heard of the Great Needle Panic, but that's probably because it wasn't in your school books. History often skips the softer meltdowns. But in certain circles, especially London's genteel salons and regional sewing societies, something truly hilarious happened. People started to believe that the old ways of embroidery were under attack. And not just under attack, of being actively eroded by moral decline. What caused it? A sudden influx of machine-made embroidery kits. Cheap, convenient, pre-colored, and worst of all, not requiring creativity. Scandalous. Picture it, you're sitting in a perfectly dusted drawing room with your needle poised and your sampler on your lap when your cousin Mildred walks in with a pillow she made. Except everyone knows she ordered the whole thing from the New London Needle Company. And gasp, it has metallic thread. Possibly even turquoise. Your hands tremble. Your embroidery circle gasps in unison. That's when it started. Clubs that once stitched together in peace began issuing manifestos. Manifestos about thread. The Ladies' Society for the Preservation of Traditional Needlecraft, yes, it existed, declared in a pamphlet that mass-produced embroidery was an affront to feminine intellect and a slow unraveling of moral fiber. That's a direct quote. These women were furious that pillows were becoming trendy, popular, accessible. One well-known fact: Victorian society loved rules. Entire books were written about how to host a dinner party without inviting scandal. So naturally, needlepoint etiquette manuals followed close behind. Some even dictated what type of pillow embroidery was acceptable for what mood. A red pillow with gold thread? Suitable only for festive evenings. A white pillow with blue stitching? Acceptable only in morning or extreme weather. And here's the quirky detail. Several households started using seasonal pillows, not just for aesthetics, but to match the emotional climate of the family. An embroidered wheat stalk on the sofa might suggest plenty and gratitude. A faded chrysanthemum? Mother is ill. Please sit quietly. Some families even used pillow embroidery to signal whether visitors were welcome. There are letters from this period, written by proper ladies with impeccable penmanship, voicing deep concern that the youth were over-embroidering. One particularly sassy grandmother in Sussex wrote to her niece, "If a young lady must waste her time on machine cushions, let be known she shall also marry a man who will wear mismatched cravats." That is Victorian-level shade, my friend. The drama escalated when certain manuals began publishing embroidery grading rubrics. Yes, your decorative pillow might be subject to critique. Was the thread imported? Were the knots even? Was the design appropriately subdued? God forbid someone use purple satin outside of Advent. There was no escaping it. You'd rest your head on a cushion that could be silently evaluated by anyone who dropped by for tea. Historians still argue over how much of this was real panic and how much was just Victorian dramatics. Some say the embroidery crisis was exaggerated, fueled by a few elite publications desperate to sell magazines. Others argue it was a genuine generational rift, a domestic equivalent of the kids are ruining everything. Meanwhile, embroiderers on the fringe began pushing back in ways that were, dare we say it, delightfully petty. Some stitched ironic verses into their pillows. This stitch is crooked, so am I. May my errors bring me rest. There's even one museum cushion that reads, in pink floss, "My soul knots freely, your approval unneeded. You love to see it." Of course, this pillow war wasn't just about thread. It was about change, technology, identity, the old world slipping just a little into the modern age. And for some, that was comforting. For others, deeply unsettling. Tonight, as you lie on your very likely machine-stitched pillow, you might feel a strange little kinship with the people of 1854. You've probably seen something similar in your time. That moment when something handmade gives way to something mass-produced. The nostalgia, the grumbling, the quiet rebellion. And maybe you think of the modern equivalent, someone at a craft fair looking at a tote bag and muttering, they just printed that with a laser. No soul in it. Some things don't change. But the Victorians took it further. They turned that angst into soft protest, stitched into pillows that looked polite but whispered mutiny. Every knot a sentence. Every curve of thread a sigh. You rest your head again, smiling softly at the absurdity, at the tenderness, at the fact that people once lost sleep over whether paisley counted as vulgar. Your breath deepens. You picture a quiet parlor. Afternoon sun through lace curtains. A pillow waiting to be finished. Someone threading a needle, eyes narrowed, determined to make one last stitch before dinner. The room is still. The fabric warm. You're not there, but you understand. And that's enough to dream on. You're sinking a little deeper now, nestled under the weight of a story that keeps weaving itself across time. And here, the fabric of history turns lyrical. Because Victorian pillows didn't just offer comfort or cautionary slogans. No, some of them spoke in silence, in symbols, in colors, in the intricate curl of a single vine. This was the language of linen, a quiet dialect of love, grief, wit, and etiquette spoken not with lips, but with needles. You didn't need a printing press to confess your feelings. You needed satin floss, steady hands, and maybe a bit of boldness hidden beneath all that tulle and starch. Picture yourself standing in a Victorian parlor again. There's a cushion on the divan, cream background, burgundy edging. On it, a tiny embroidered sprig of forget-me-nots curling into the shape of a crescent moon. No quote, no obvious message. But to anyone versed in this unspoken textile tongue, the meaning is crystal clear. I remember you even when you're not watching. Victorians loved coded systems. Fans had their own flirtation gestures. Glove removals could be flirty or scandalous depending on sequence. But pillows? They were the ideal medium for those too refined or too afraid to say what they meant aloud. One well-known fact, the floriography craze swept Britain in the mid-19th century. Entire dictionaries were published assigning specific meanings to flowers. This extended naturally into embroidery, where pillows became not just decoration, but emotional declarations. A blue cornflower meant hope. Ivy meant fidelity. Rosemary, remembrance. If you stitched a marigold, watch out. It meant jealousy. And it wasn't just the flower, it was how it was stitched. A flower leaning left might signify longing. Upright, strength. Drooping? Perhaps despair. Or maybe the embroiderer just ran out of tea. Historians argue about this kind of thing more than you'd expect. But here's a lesser-known curiosity. In some households, a pillow could be used to correct someone's behavior. Not directly, not rudely, just gently, subtly. For example, a guest known to overstay their welcome might one day find their favorite armchair now featured a new embroidered cushion with the words, "Time and tact, twin graces." But make it soft. You imagine someone laboring over that phrase, trying to center it perfectly on the canvas while fuming about Cousin Everett's insistence on staying 3 extra nights. And yet, even as they fumed, their stitches stayed tight. The passive aggression was precise. Victorians were artists in this, even more delightful. Some pillows were so coded that only one person in the household truly understood them. A wife might stitch a fox with a peacock feather in its mouth, referring to a private family joke from a long-forgotten picnic. To guests, it was charmingly odd. To the husband, a reminder that she still remembered that time he tripped in a fountain. And then there were pun pillows. These were particularly popular among younger women, embroidery rebels who giggled behind lace fans and knew exactly what they were doing. One extant example simply reads, "Thread lightly." Another from 1871. Pillow fortified. Wordplay wasn't just permitted, it was prized. You gently run your thoughts across these forgotten phrases, imagining the rooms they lived in, the people who stitched them, the tiny rebellions they carried. And of course, there's debate. Scholars still puzzle over certain recurring motifs. Pine cones stitched into corners, blank scrolls, small embroidered spoons. Were they just decorative? Or did they mean something deeper? A few theorists propose that some of these patterns were borrowed from earlier Celtic or Norse traditions, infused with generational memory. Others think some motifs were simply fashionable. Trend, like chevrons or mid-century avocado green. Not everything is profound, but maybe it is. That's the beauty of interpretation. You picture a woman sitting by gaslight, spectacles low on her nose, stitching a pillow meant for the guest bed. She pauses, considers a sprig of lavender, adds it not because anyone will notice, but because it's what her grandmother used to stitch, and it brings her peace. Maybe no one will decode it. Maybe someone will. It doesn't matter. The meaning is stitched into her breath. Tonight, you're resting your head on modern cotton. But in your mind, the fabric beneath you blooms with invisible messages. Threads that shimmer like memory. Patterns that whisper, I was here. I felt this. I made this with care. You smile, even as your eyelids droop. Because now you know. Sometimes, the softest things say the most. The pillow under your head feels a little heavier now. Not in a bad way, but in the way old stories do when they start to settle into the folds of your thoughts. Weighted with history. Stitched with something deeper. And as we drift onward, you realize that Victorian pillows weren't just pretty. They were surprisingly therapeutic. Yes, really. They weren't just about lace and flirtation. They were emotional support systems disguised as decor. And tonight, you lie your head on one not just to rest, but to feel understood. Welcome to the world of emotional hygiene through embroidery. In a society where talking about your feelings was about as acceptable as showing your ankles at a funeral, people needed a release. For many Victorian women, and more men than they'd ever admit, that release came through thread. You close your eyes and picture a quiet room. Afternoon light filtering through thick curtains. Clock ticking. A chair creaking softly. In the corner, someone sits hunched over a pillow cover, stitching. Not because it's fashionable. Not because it's expected. But because their mind is full and their hands need something steady. One well-known fact. Embroidery was promoted as a soothing pastime in dozens of 19th century health manuals. Doctors genuinely believed that the rhythmic motion of stitching could calm hysteria, regulate moods, and even prevent female melancholy, a term that definitely sounds like a slow indie band, but at the time covered everything from seasonal blues to postpartum depression. Less well known, some doctors prescribed pillow embroidery specifically as part of therapeutic regimens. Why? Because it allowed the patient to produce something soft, comforting, and visually pleasing, while still staying quiet and ladle-like. In short, a socially acceptable way to have a breakdown, one petal at a time. But here's the unexpectedly tender twist. Some of these emotional support pillows were never meant for display. They weren't shown to guests. They were tucked away in bedrooms, placed on favorite chairs, or even held close during long, sleepless nights. They often didn't contain quotes, just looping vines, gentle curves, or repetitive motifs. The point wasn't to impress. The point was to stitch through the feeling. There's a famous surviving example of this in the Victoria and Albert Museum, a small linen cushion stitched in varying shades of brown and gray. No flowers, no text, just row after row of tiny, identical running stitches. Almost obsessive, almost invisible. It's labeled Maker Unknown 1878, and the curator's note simply reads, believed to be made during a period of bereavement. You imagine the person who made it. Maybe she lost someone. Maybe she was just overwhelmed. Maybe she couldn't say out loud what she felt, but she could thread it, row after row, hour after hour. That cushion became her journal. Her release. Her quiet rebellion against a world that told her to smile more and sit still. And the pillows that were shown off, sometimes they masked those feelings in subtle ways. A single daisy stitched upside down. A phrase with a missing word. A corner left deliberately unfinished, like a pause mid-sentence. Historians still debate whether this unfinished corner motif was a trend, a mistake, or code. Some say it symbolized that the maker didn't believe anything was ever truly complete. Others believe it was a quiet acknowledgement of mortality, memento mori by omission. And some scholars, they argue it was just because someone spilled tea on the canvas and gave up. Valid. But this wasn't just about grief. People embroidered joy too. Recovery. Hope. You'd find cushions with little suns peeking over stitched hills, with threadwork birds mid-flight, with messages like, "This too shall pass, but while it stays, I stitch." Yes, that one's real. And oddly reassuring. The act of stitching, especially on something soft like a pillow, became a meditative practice. Thread in, thread out. Breathing in, breathing out. It's like yoga, but with more needles and fewer downward dogs. And here's where things get even more relatable. Some pillows were frustration projects. Not delicate heirlooms. Just messy, slightly crooked, color-clashing vents of emotional chaos. Stitched during arguments. During illness. During long winter nights when nothing felt fair and no one was listening. You imagine one now. Lavender fabric, heavy green thread, slightly too tight. The phrase is stitched in blocky letters. Today was a lot. It's not museum-worthy, but it's true. And someone needed to say it. Tonight, as you lie there listening to the rhythm of your own breath, you might wonder, if you had to stitch one phrase onto the pillow beneath your head, what would it be? A wish? A joke? A small confession? Or maybe nothing? Just a pattern? A single curl of ivy? A repeating spiral? Something that feels like exhaling? You don't have to answer. Not now. Just let the softness hold you. Let the steady thrum of the story continue stitching itself into your dream. Because sometimes, rest begins in the hands. And healing, sometimes it starts with a pillow. You're drifting now, further into the folds of fabric and time, where the world quiets and every detail softens. And just when you thought Victorian pillows were merely sentimental or soothing, a new thread pulls your thoughts towards something far more unexpected. Judgment. Yes. Tonight you rest your head on an object that, in another time, might have quietly scolded you for forgetting to pray, or for wearing slightly too much rouge to supper. Because in the golden glow of gaslight and the click of a well-behaved clock, pillows didn't just comfort the weary, they offered gentle moral correction to anyone who got too comfortable. These were the preacher pillows. The parlor prophets. Those artfully embroidered cushions that sat on your aunt's best chair and said, in threadwork script, "Idle laughter is the devil's chorus. Sleep tight." Some Victorian pillows became miniature pulpits. Stitching wasn't just for beauty or expression. It was a vessel for virtue reinforcement, especially in middle-class homes, where propriety mattered almost as much as tea temperature. And what better way to uphold your household's moral tone than with a cushion that subtly implies your guests are one poor decision away from ruin? One well-known fact: Victorian society was obsessed with self-improvement. Books, pamphlets, and lectures on proper conduct were everywhere. So naturally, that obsession spilled into interior decor. It wasn't enough to just live a good life. You had to decorate like you were under divine observation. A lesser-known detail: entire embroidery pamphlets were published with collections of moral sayings for the drawing room. These included phrases like, "Order is heaven's first law," "Clean hands, clear conscience," and the particularly pointed, "She who whispers lies." That's right. In the age before passive-aggressive text, your furniture handled the dirty work. You can imagine it, can't you? A guest settles into the chaise with her second slice of cake, only to find herself leaning against a stitched reminder. Temperance is a grace most rare. Suddenly that sponge is less appealing. And it wasn't just the text. Placement mattered too. Pillows of judgment were deliberately arranged to catch your eye the moment you sat down. There was the famous hallway pillow, often placed on a small bench near the front door, embroidered with something like, "Enter purely, depart in peace," which sounds serene until you realize it's basically saying, "Don't bring your mess in here, Reginald." Historians have debated whether these moral pillows were taken seriously, or if they were more performative than prescriptive. Some argue they were genuine tools for reinforcing household values, especially for children. Others think they were a kind of moral theater, part of the elaborate Victorian habit of staging the home as a space of visible virtue. But here's where things get deliciously odd. People competed over whose pillows were the most morally refined. Embroidery clubs held quiet contests. Some women stitched entire verses from sermons onto their pillows, in Latin, just a flex. One record from Devonshire notes a pillow with a full beatitude stitched in golden thread across a velvet base. That's 8 blessings. on one cushion. Imagine trying to nap on that. Yet amid all this stitched righteousness, there were rebels, subtle ones, whispering ones. A few surviving pillows from the late Victorian period show a shift, phrases that sound like morality but read more like satire. Take, for example, the now infamous embroidery. Dutiful in daylight, dreaming by dusk. To the casual guest, it sounds like a praise of diligence. But those who knew the embroiderer, a former governess turned suffragette, read it very differently. Dreaming, in this case, meant scheming. You rest your head and wonder what your pillow would say if it were made in 1882. Would it nudge you with something like, "Rest is earned, not claimed"? Or would it lift its stitched eyebrow and offer, "Procrastination is but tomorrow's sorrow"? Victorians had a way of making everything rhyme and everything slightly guilt-inducing. And yet, there's tenderness in these scolding stitches, a belief that the home could shape the soul, that even a pillow soft embroidered, perched in a velvet chair, could remind you to be a little better, a little quieter, a little more refined. You smile, not out of shame, but affection. Because deep down, these pillows were stitched with care, by hands that believed in order and kindness, in the idea that every detail, no matter how small, mattered. The thread beneath your cheek may not preach, it may not scold, but tonight, it carries the echo of those old moral cushions. And maybe, just maybe, it whispers, "Rest well, be kind, don't gossip." You breathe in, the night deepens, the edges of the story soften once more, and still, the stitching continues. You're floating now in that perfect liminal place, not quite awake, not quite asleep, where history becomes less like a lesson and more like a dream stitched together with fine thread and long-forgotten stories. And just as you're adjusting to the idea that Victorian pillow embroidery was mostly the realm of proper ladies with delicate fingers and serious opinions about buttonholes, a new thread surprises you. Because, my friend, not all embroiderers wore corsets. Let's talk about the secret lives of Victorian gentlemen stitchers. Yes, men who embroidered. Not just the occasional hobbyist. Not just a handful of dashing eccentrics. But a surprising number of clergymen, aristocrats, and quietly rebellious scholars who turn to the needle for relief, expression, or, let's be honest, to get out of mandatory fox hunting. Imagine it, you wander into a well-appointed study. Oak shelves, a globe no one spins, a fireplace with a brass fender, and there by the window, not a writing desk, but a needlework frame. Resting on it, a pillow cover in progress. The motif? A pair of dragons playing chess. Because, of course, one well-known fact, embroidery was part of the education of boys in certain 18th and early 19th century households, especially among the upper classes. It was seen as a useful exercise in patience, precision, and fine motor skills. Kind of like fencing, but with less bruising. But as the Victorian period progressed, embroidery increasingly became coded as feminine, and thus many male stitchers either stopped or stitched in secret. That's where the magic happens. Obscure detail: in several surviving personal journals from the 1860 SADS, male writers make cryptic references to linen contemplation, private threading, or even evening ferns, all polite euphemisms for unwinding with a bit of embroidery after dinner. It was a practice rarely discussed, almost never flaunted, and yet quietly prevalent. And some of them were phenomenal. There's a pillow cover in a private collection in Manchester that features an intricate depiction of the solar system, each planet represented in metallic thread, with Latin mottos stitched in looping cursive. It's signed simply RMH 1874. No one knows who he was, but we can be fairly sure he spent more on silk floss than most bachelors spent on whiskey. Now, Victorian masculinity being what it was, rigid, proud, and easily scandalized, some of these men embroidered under the guise of scientific illustration. One barrister from Bath famously produced an entire cushion set featuring fungi, stitched in excruciating detail. He presented them as natural studies for post-luncheon rumination, But come on, that man just loved a good mushroom motif. Still, these hidden stitchers weren't always hiding in shame. Some embraced their needlework as a philosophical act, to create something gentle in a world of industrial noise and social rigidity, to place beauty where there might otherwise be silence, to embroider, perhaps, as a form of meditation. Historians still debate how widespread this practice was. Some believe the handful of documented male embroiderers were outliers, lone oddities. Others suggest a much larger population stitched quietly, especially among the clergy and aging bachelors with too many nephews. And then there's the folklore. Tales passed down in quiet village sewing circles of the embroidering parson who gifted moral pillows to his parishioners, or the reclusive lord who filled his library with needlework depictions of Norse legends. These stories may be exaggerated, but then again, every tale has a stitch of truth in it. You picture one now, a quiet man in a waistcoat, spectacles low, candlelight flickering. He's working slowly, steadily, on a cushioned cover that features a ship in stormy seas. His house is empty. His supper was modest. But here, in this one small square of linen, he is in control. He chooses the wind. He stitches the storm. And you feel it. That hush, that sacred quiet. Because in this moment, the boundaries soften between genders, between disciplines, between what's acceptable and what's simply human. The need to create, to express, to rest. You pull the covers a little higher. Your breath slows. Somewhere, long ago, a gentleman bent over his needle, threading a little piece of himself into a pillow. And now, tonight, you drift on that legacy, half sleeping, half stitching, fully at peace. You stir slightly, but not out of discomfort. It's the kind of stirring that comes with curiosity, the quiet unraveling of a new story just beginning to bloom. Your head still rests on the soft past, and now we move into territory as familiar as gossip and as serious as a proper stitch count. Because if you thought embroidery was always solitary, oh no, not in Victorian society. In fact, embroidery was often a team sport, and that team could be as supportive or as petty as any high school drama club. Welcome to the world of embroidery societies and stitching cliques, where needlework was less about cushions and more about social positioning. Let's just say, if you didn't know your satin stitch from your seed stitch, you might as well have sat in the hallway. You imagine the scene, a sunlit drawing room in 1863. Lace curtains, chintz upholstery, 7 women seated in a perfect circle, each with her own embroidery hoop, teacup, and air of polite rivalry. At the center of the table, a basket of patterned books and biscuits no one actually touches. The silence is serene, but just under the surface, a thread of tension tighter than anyone's French knot. One well-known fact: Victorian society revolved heavily around clubs, circles, and gatherings. From literary salons to bird-watching groups, being part of a society meant you belonged. It also meant you were being watched, evaluated, not just for what you made, but how you behaved while making it. And embroidery groups were no exception. Obscure detail? In certain upper-middle-class neighborhoods, particularly in London and Bath, embroidery guest books were kept. Yes, guests at stitching sessions were encouraged to sign their names next to the project they brought. Notes like Mrs. Pembroke commenced tulip border, admirable consistency in stitch, or the more ominous Miss DeWitt hemmed prematurely. Spirited, but lacks symmetry. It wasn't just social. It was performative. And then there were the unspoken rules. Never copy someone's pattern without permission. Never criticize someone's shading unless they ask. Always offer polite compliments, but never more than 2 per cushion. This wasn't embroidery. It was a balancing act on a very delicate lace tightrope. Yet these societies weren't all silent warfare. There was real camaraderie, too. Young women learned from older ones, and stories were passed from needle to needle. Births were celebrated with christening cushions, engagements with love token pillows, Even minor milestones like finish my first daffodil border were toasted with tea and rhubarb scones. But make no mistake, some stitching circles were exclusive. The closer you got to aristocratic drawing rooms, the more embroidery became a sign of control. Your hands needed to be as composed as your posture. One duchess famously dismissed a guest for bringing applique work to a strictly crewel-only salon. That guest was never seen again. Well, socially anyway. And sometimes, these circles blurred into full-blown cliques. You might be surprised to know that even embroidery had fashion cycles. The fern motif craze of the 1870s started in a Kensington embroidery club, then spread like decorative wildfire. The minimalist wave of tone-on-tone thread in the 1880s, that was considered avant-garde and secretly detested by traditionalists. Historians still debate whether these stylistic shifts reflected deeper political or social undercurrents. Were simpler stitches a rebellion against excess? Was floral embroidery an unconscious reclaiming of femininity in a mechanized world? Or was it all just seasonal trends? The truth probably lies somewhere between the stitches. Of course, not every group was snobbish. Some embroidery circles became genuine lifelines for their members, spaces where grief could be stitched through, laughter shared, secrets exchanged. In mining towns and coastal villages, women met not to compete, but to stay warm, stay sane, and keep each other company as the world outside carried on. And lest we forget, the rise of penny pattern booklets in the late 19th century meant even those without society connections could begin their own circles. Kitchen table cliques, porch stitchers, a quiet revolution in floss. Tonight, as you nestle into your modern world, you may picture those gatherings. Women seated around candlelight, laughter stitched in between critiques, the quiet closeness that comes from working side by side. Maybe they gossiped, maybe they judged, but they stitched, and in doing so, they created not just pillows, but communities. And maybe if you close your eyes just a little tighter, you can feel them near. Whispering patterns, comparing floss shades, gently elbowing each other when the preacher's wife dropped her hoop. Because history, after all, isn't just what we remember. It's what we make together. By now, your thoughts have softened like well-washed linen. You've wandered through parlors and sewing circles, flirted with stitch secrets, and even weathered a few passive-aggressive pillow proverbs. But something's been following us this whole time, quietly, purring. Because here's a thread you may not have noticed, cats. Oh yes, the Victorians adored them, and perhaps nowhere more surprisingly than on their pillows. So tonight we curl up with the animal icons of embroidery, and most especially the cult of the embroidered cat. Imagine a pillow squat, overstuffed, probably in someone's better parlor, and on its face, stitched in 10 shades of gray and black, is a cat. Not a mythical lion, not a heraldic beast, just a regular, judgy little domestic cat, sitting on a teacup, looking like it owns the house. Which, of course, it probably did. One well-known fact, the Victorian era saw a boom in pet keeping, particularly among the urban middle class. Cats, once considered mostly barn animals or mousers, became fashionable household companions. Queen Victoria herself kept a beloved blue Persian, which, in true royal tradition, had a better diet and personal physician than most factory workers. This feline obsession found its way into the embroidery world with gusto. Cats began appearing on everything: slippers, handkerchiefs, and most delightfully, pillows. Embroidered in silk thread, velvet applique, or even painted on detail later touched up with stitching. But why cats? Why not dogs, horses, or parrots in waistcoats? Well, there were those too. But cats had something special. In a culture obsessed with symbolism, cats embodied independence, mystery, and domestic grace. Stitching a cat onto your pillow was like saying, "I enjoy quiet company, mild chaos, and being silently judged while I sew." A lesser-known detail, some embroidery manuals contained entire pages of feline poses, each one with its own meaning. Curled up cat? Serenity. A stretching cat? Alertness. A cat pulling at a ball of yarn? Domestic playfulness? Or possibly a metaphor for your relationship with your in-laws? Interpret as needed. And the fashion didn't stop at mere portraits. Oh no. The Victorians anthropomorphized their cats with alarming creativity. Some pillows featured cats wearing waistcoats, monocles, or carrying parasols. One popular pattern shows a cat sipping tea beside a hedgehog in a bonnet. It's unclear why. Historians still debate whether this was satire, whimsy, or a very specific fever dream. You picture it now. Someone stitching that teacup cat, tongue poking out slightly in concentration, giggling just a little at the absurdity. Maybe they stitched it as a gift. Maybe they just like cats. Or maybe they were tired of stitching forget-me-nots and moral slogans and wanted something with fur and flair. And let's not forget the mourning cat. Yes, embroidered cats even made their way into memorial cushions. These were typically stitched in darker threads, grays, blacks, deep blues, and often featured a small cat curled beside an embroidered slipper or empty chair. Symbols of presence that remained after loss. Because sometimes the cat is the one who stays. Of course, this isn't just nostalgia. Even today, cat embroidery has never really left us. It just went digital. But in the Victorian era, every tiny whisker, every toe bean had to be hand-stitched. And they did it lovingly. You smile at the thought of it. Not grand battles or declarations of empire. Just someone quietly, carefully stitching a sleeping cat onto a pillow because it made them feel happy, safe, less alone. Maybe that's the real reason these little feline icons became so common. In a world full of etiquette and performance, a stitched cat reminded everyone that sometimes it's okay to nap, to do nothing, to be soft, to be curled in a sunbeam and let the world keep turning without you. And maybe that's what you're doing now. Tonight, your pillow might not feature a gray tabby in a cravat, but you can feel her there, watching with quiet approval. A stitched sentinel of sleep. She doesn't mind if you snore. She's just glad you're resting. By now, your thoughts have softened like well-washed linen. You've wandered through parlors and sewing circles, flirted with stitched secrets, and even weathered a few passive-aggressive pillow proverbs. But something's been following us this whole time, quietly, purring. Because here's a thread you may not have noticed, cats. Oh yes, the Victorians adored them, and perhaps nowhere more surprisingly than on their pillows. So tonight we curl up with the animal icons of embroidery, and most especially the cult of the embroidered cat. Imagine a pillow squat, overstuffed, probably in someone's better parlor, and on its face, stitched in 10 shades of gray and black, is cat. Not a mythical lion, not a heraldic beast, just a regular, judgy little domestic cat, sitting on a teacup, looking like it owns the house. Which, of course, it probably did. One well-known fact, the Victorian era saw a boom in pet keeping, particularly among the urban middle class. Cats, once considered mostly barn animals or mousers, became fashionable household companions. Queen Victoria herself kept a beloved blue Persian, which, in true royal tradition, had a better diet and personal physician than most factory workers. This feline obsession found its way into the embroidery world with gusto. Cats began appearing on everything: slippers, handkerchiefs, and most delightfully, pillows. Embroidered in silk thread, velvet applique, or even painted on detail later touched up with stitching. But why cats? Why not dogs, horses, or parrots in waistcoats? Well, there were those too. But cats had something special. In a culture obsessed with symbolism, cats embodied independence, mystery, and domestic grace. Stitching a cat onto your pillow was like saying, "I enjoy quiet company, mild chaos, and being silently judged while I sew." A lesser-known detail, some embroidery manuals contained entire pages of feline poses, each one with its own meaning. A curled-up cat? Serenity. A stretching cat? Alertness. A cat pulling at a ball of yarn? domestic playfulness, or possibly a metaphor for your relationship with your in-laws. Interpret as needed. And the fashion didn't stop at mere portraits. Oh no. The Victorians anthropomorphized their cats with alarming creativity. Some pillows featured cats wearing waistcoats, monocles, or carrying parasols. One popular pattern shows a cat sipping tea beside a hedgehog in a bonnet. It's unclear why. Historians still debate whether this was satire, whimsy, or a very specific fever dream. You picture it now. Someone stitching that teacup cat, tongue poking out slightly in concentration, giggling just a little at the absurdity. Maybe they stitched it as a gift. Maybe they just liked cats. Or maybe they were tired of stitching forget-me-nots and moral slogans and wanted something with fur and flair. And let's not forget the mourning cat. Yes, embroidered cats even made their way into memorial cushions. These were typically stitched in darker threads, grays, blacks, deep blues, and often featured a small cat curled beside an embroidered slipper or empty chair. Symbols of presence that remained after loss. Because sometimes the cat is the one who stays. Of course, this isn't just nostalgia. Even today, cat embroidery has never really left us. It just went digital. But in the Victorian era, every tiny whisker, every toe bean had to be hand-stitched. And they did it lovingly. You smile at the thought of it. Not grand battles or declarations of empire. Just someone quietly, carefully stitching a sleeping cat onto a pillow because it made them feel happy, safe, less alone. Maybe that's the real reason these little feline icons became so common. In a world full of etiquette and performance, a stitched cat reminded everyone that sometimes it's okay to nap, to do nothing, to be soft, to be curled in a sunbeam and let the world keep turning without you. And maybe that's what you're doing now. Tonight, your pillow might not feature a gray tabby in a cravat, but you can feel her there, watching with quiet approval. A stitched sentinel of sleep. She doesn't mind if you snore. She's just glad you're resting. You're deep now, beneath layers of lace and memory, cradled by cushions and time. But this next part peeks behind the embroidery hoop and out into the wider world. Because while many Victorian pillows were stitched by firelight and gossip, others were sewn beneath sun-baked balconies in faraway colonies, stitched into existence with hands both native and foreign. Let's drift into the shadowed seams of colonial threads and imperial dreams, a soft-spoken but heavy tale of embroidered pillows and the empires they quietly carried. You see, the British Empire, for all its grand pronouncements and steamships and imperial tea sets, didn't just export wool and rule. It also exported embroidery. And imported it too. Patterns crossed oceans. Silks were traded. And colonial households, especially those run by British women abroad, turned to embroidery as both pastime and projection. One well-known fact: the Victorian British Empire spanned nearly a quarter of the world by the 1880s. And with that sprawl came countless interactions with cultures who had already been stitching beauty into cloth for centuries. From India's elaborate kanta quilting to Egypt's vibrant kayamiya applique, embroidery was never Europe's invention. It was merely another tapestry into which it wove itself, sometimes gracefully, sometimes not. But the lesser-known part: in colonial outposts from Calcutta to Cape Town, British women would frequently employ local artisans to create or assist with their embroidery, especially for large cushions, wall hangings, or ceremonial gifts. Sometimes it was collaborative. Often it was exploitative. A diary entry from a tea planter's wife in Assam reads, "The native women are quick with their fingers. I've had them replicate Mrs. Pembroke's lace trim with startling success. It's easy to picture, if you don't blink too hard at the power imbalance, a parlor surrounded by stitched samplers while outside, skilled hands labor without credit." Some exotic motifs made their way into parlors back home: parrots, banyan trees, elephants, and lotus blossoms, replicated from local textiles and adapted for fashionable pillows. Patterns were borrowed, a generous word, from indigenous artistry, and converted into what London magazines called Oriental flourishes. Historians still argue over how to interpret these pieces. Were they admiration wrapped in ignorance? Cultural synthesis born from sincere curiosity? Or a form of decorative colonialism, lifting symbols from one world and softening them into cushions for another? You picture one such pillow, a deep indigo square stitched with golden lotus petals, designed by a British woman in Rangoon but clearly inspired by the temple murals across town. The stitches are careful. The corners are stiff, but the lotus somehow still glows. And while some of these motifs were aesthetic curiosities, others became symbols of empire. In military households, pillows were sometimes embroidered with regimental badges, campaign dates, or battle maps. These weren't just decorations, they were soft monuments to conquest, proof stitched into parlors. But amid all that pomp and appropriated patterning, there were quiet rebellions. Some women in colonial households began commissioning local needleworkers not to replicate, but to teach. They'd learn stitches they couldn't find in English manuals. They'd integrate regional methods into their pillows, not as trophies, but as homage. One Anglo-Indian woman sampler, discovered in a Wiltshire attic, features English daisies, stitched entirely using folklore techniques from Punjab. And the most poetic twist? In a few surviving cases, pillows made by colonizers and pillows made by colonized artisans ended up side by side in the same homes. Two stories. One sofa. One particularly haunting piece now sits in a museum archive, a small worn cushion embroidered in coarse wool with the words, "I am stitched from many hands." No author. No date. Just that. You lie there now, your own hands still, your body quiet. And you wonder, how many of the threads in your world, your comforts, your traditions were spun elsewhere? How many cushions rest on borrowed stitches? There's no shame in not knowing, only softness in remembering. Tonight, you lie on a pillow that doesn't judge, but it does remember. It carries the patterns of many lives. Yours now, too. You're fully wrapped in it now, the hush between dreams and daylight, where every breath feels like a thread and every thought like a slow, gentle stitch. And in this part of the night, the story takes on a deeper weight. Not heavy, just honest. Because there's a kind of embroidery you don't make for parties. You don't display it in the parlor or gift it with a smile. You make it because something inside you must. Because someone is gone, and the silence needs company. Tonight, we rest on the quiet softness of morning cushions, pillows made not just for comfort, but for grief. The Victorians, as you might know, were spectacularly dedicated to mourning. There were rules, rituals, and timelines for everything. What to wear, when to socialize again, how long to veil one's face. Black crepe and jet jewelry, lockets with hair, funeral biscuits and paper printed with prayers. But what's often overlooked is the role embroidery played in that grief. More specifically, the pillow as a site of quiet remembrance. One well-known fact: widows were encouraged to take up needlework during their mourning period, not just to occupy idle hands, but to keep the spirit focused and virtuous. Grief, after all, had to be dignified, controlled, decorative even. And so mourning pillows. These were typically small, lap-sized, worked in grays, blacks, violets, or navy blues. Sometimes they bore initials, sometimes a date, but often they simply held symbols: willows, urns, angels in profile, weeping eyes, or vines cut short. But here's a lesser-known, strangely intimate detail. Some pillows were embroidered with the hair of the deceased, woven into the thread, twined into the backing, hidden sometimes behind the seams. The Victorians didn't fear death the way we do. They folded it into their daily lives, into the furniture, into the fabric. Imagine it, you've lost someone. You sit by the window with a light barely strong enough to guide your needle. You thread their hair through the eye, clumsily at first, trembling. But you do it. You work a small pattern, maybe a leaf, Maybe a name, maybe just a swirl. You don't show anyone. But every night, your fingers find that pillow, and you rest your hand there, because it feels like memory. Some of these morning cushions were purely decorative, set out for special remembrance days. Others were placed in beds, meant to cradle the head while the heart healed. There's a famous example from Liverpool, a child's morning pillow, embroidered with a lamb sleeping on a cloud. The initials are stitched in fading blue. The back panel, never meant to be seen, bears the words, "Still mine." You don't have to cry, but it's okay if you feel something. Historians still debate whether these pillows were acts of healing or rituals of containment. Did they soothe grief, or just wrap it in something society could accept? Some scholars argue that morning embroidery reinforced repression. Others believe it gave women, especially, a private space to speak what could not be said. Perhaps both are true. Because grief isn't tidy, it doesn't follow patterns. But sometimes patterns help. They give shape to the shapeless. They hold space when words falter. And here's a quirk of the era that might surprise you. Not all morning pillows were somber. Some, especially among fringe communities, used bright colors: reds, golds, emerald greens, not out of disrespect, but defiance. A way of saying they are still here in beauty. One pillow, discovered in a Yorkshire attic, depicts a garden blooming from a coffin. Beneath it, the words, "Her roots hold me still." Tonight, you don't need a pillow stitched with lilies or initials, but the one beneath your head carries all of this now. It remembers for you, not just the loss, but the love, the lingering warmth, the hand that once embroidered a vine, stitch by careful stitch, in the middle of a storm. So breathe gently. Someone once rested here. Someone once wept here. And now, softer than sorrow, quieter than time, you sleep here too. The night is deep now, velvet around your thoughts, soft as well-worn muslin. You've traveled far across thread and time, but before your journey closes, there's one final twist in the pattern you didn't expect. Because sometimes, in the silence between stitch and sigh, there's laughter. Tonight, we rest our heads on the unexpectedly joyful absurdity of humorous pillows and embroidered nonsense. Yes, despite their love for propriety and seriousness, the Victorians had a deeply weird sense of humor. And if you knew where to look, usually tucked in attics or behind the faded formality of the parlor, you'd find it embroidered into their pillows, one pawn at a time. You imagine one now, a neat little cushion with perfect corners and tidy tassels. On its front, stitched in delicate navy thread, it reads, "Bless this mess, and also my biscuit tin." Not exactly biblical, but deeply relatable. One well-known fact: the Victorian era gave rise to nonsense literature. Edward Lear's limericks, Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, and satirical periodicals like Punch. These absurdities didn't stay in books. They found their way onto cloth. Obscure detail? In the latter half of the 19th century, a trend emerged in smaller towns and among eccentric hobbyists, the whimsy cushion. These were embroidered pillows featuring ridiculous phrases, twisted proverbs, or visual puns, designed not to instruct, but to amuse, and occasionally to baffle. A few documented examples include: a stitch in time saves rosemary, surrounded by herbs. Obviously, sit here and become wiser, or at least warmer. If you can read this, refill my tea. And then there's the now famous cabbage cushion, held in a private collection in Oxford. It features an oversized cabbage stitched in shades of green silk, and in the middle, in looping cursive. Let us leave this argument behind. Legend says it was created by a pair of sisters who could never agree on politics, but did agree on vegetables. These weren't mass-produced jokes. They were often one-of-a-kind. Inside jokes, domestic satire, embroidered smirks. And here's the twist. Many were created by people who never spoke back at dinner parties. The quiet ones, the dutiful daughters. the widowed aunt with impeccable jam. Humor became their rebellion. Subtle, stitched, undeniable. Historians don't talk about these as much, perhaps because they weren't important. But maybe that's what makes them vital. Laughter stitched by someone who needed a moment of softness. A way to reclaim space. A way to say, I see the absurdity, and I'm in on the joke. You picture one of these stitchers now, sitting on a stool too short for her table, squinting into the lamplight, tongue pressed to her teeth in concentration. She chooses her colors carefully, knowing that someday someone will sit on this ridiculous thing and laugh, or at least smile. And that, to her, is more satisfying than perfect symmetry. And of course, there were occasional scandalous pillows. Not crass, mind you. The Victorians would never. But suggestive, teasing. A famous example from a Suffolk salon reads, "This pillow has secrets. Don't ask it after midnight. Is it flirty? Is it cursed? Is it referencing someone's unfortunate elopement with a piano teacher? We'll never know." Tonight, you rest on a pillow that might not say anything silly. But in your mind, you've wandered across hundreds, each one whispering mischief beneath its stitches. Because even the most solemn households needed to laugh. Even the most precise needle needed to loosen sometimes. And even the stiffest cushion needed to say something ridiculous, just to make the weight of the world a little lighter. So you smile there in the darkness. You imagine your own nonsense pillow. Maybe it says, "Do not disturb unless tea or dragons," or "Thread level, emotionally tangled." And in that moment, you sleep better. Because humor, stitched softly, whispered through floss, is also a kind of balm, a secret spell, a reminder that even embroidered history isn't all solemn silence. Sometimes it giggles. The night has grown hushed, almost reverent, like an old linen closet opening itself slowly, letting out breath, memory, and time. But before we reach our final rest, we pause for something sacred. Tonight, your pillow becomes an altar. Because in the most devout corners of Victorian life, embroidery became prayer, a silent act of devotion stitched with patience and trembling hands. Welcome to the world of devotional pillows, where thread was a form of worship and even the tiniest cushion might carry the weight of someone's soul. One well-known fact: the Victorians were profoundly spiritual. Their homes bore religious texts, icons, and scripture verses embroidered into everything from samplers to wall hangings. But tucked quietly among these were small, unassuming pillows, crafted not for display, but for private devotion. They were called many things: kneelers, resting pads, angel pillows. Some were purely practical, made for church pews or prayer corners, but others held deeper significance. Made by hand, these pillows bore verses, blessings, or even full prayers in delicate floss. Placed near bedside tables, beneath windows, or beneath folded hands during moments of grief or meditation, they weren't meant for comfort. They were meant for connection. You imagine one now, a square of pale muslin, corners rounded with age. In one corner, faint script: "Bless me in sleep, O watcher of hours." Its stitches are imperfect, not sloppy, just human. As if the embroiderer paused often, uncertain whether to keep going, whether the act itself was enough. Obscure detail? In some Quaker and Methodist households, devotional pillows were stitched by children during rites of passage. The idea was that the physical act of stitching sacred words helped bind them to the soul. A quiet apprenticeship of reverence, handed down not through sermons, but through thread. Others were stitched during long illnesses, each letter sewn over hours, sometimes days, with fingers trembling from fever or age. One cushion, preserved in a museum in Kent, bears a single word: mercy. No border, no design, just that, stitched in navy blue, centered, perfect. Historians still debate the function of these pillows. Were they tools? Offerings? Did they replace prayer or extend it? And why were so many tucked away, found only in attics, drawers, or forgotten hope chests? Maybe because they were too personal, too intimate. These are not for guests, not for display. They were stitched in solitude when no one was looking, when the night was long and the only witness was a candle and the silence between breaths. But sometimes they were gifted. A mother might embroider a prayer pillow for her child's new home. A sister might stitch one for a brother traveling abroad. A friend might leave one anonymously at a neighbor's door after a death. Each one a gesture of care that spoke in whisper, not command. You can almost hear it now. The quiet prayers stitched into linen, not for God to hear, but for the self to remember. And it wasn't just Christian scripture. In Jewish households, small embroidered pillows bore Hebrew blessings or the Shema. In some parts of colonial India, Hindu households adapted the practice, sewing devotional images into fabric not for worship, but for centering the spirit before sleep. Because across belief systems, one thing was true: a handmade object carries something sacred, and when it rests beneath the head or hands, during the most vulnerable moments, it becomes more than cloth. It becomes a kind of shield, a whisper, a vow. You don't have to be religious to understand this. Tonight, your own pillow may not bear scripture, but perhaps it carries a hope, question, a quiet plea. Let me rest. Let me dream. Let me wake whole. So you sink deeper now, not into sleep, but into trust, into stillness, into the soft breath of the generations before you, who once stitched their fears into fabric, their hopes into borders, their faith into the spaces between petals. And they rest with you now. All their quiet prayers, beneath your head. You've made it here, thread by thread, sigh by sigh. The journey is nearly complete. The world of embroidered pillows has opened fully to you, its comforts, its whispers, its strange histories and quiet rebellions. But as all things must, this too gently draws to a close. And so we return softly to the beginning. Tonight, we lie on a pillow not just filled with down or cotton, but with memory. Because in the end, that's what these embroidered cushions were. Memory made visible. Emotion made tactile. Little landscapes of thought, stitched in calm defiance of the world's chaos. This last pillow? It's not in a museum. It isn't ornate. It doesn't bear the name of any duchess or preacher's daughter. It's yours. And it has grown with every story you've heard tonight. A corner of it holds the echo of that old widow's sorrow, her fingers threading loss into something she could sleep beside. Another edge hums with the purring shape of a teacup cat. In the center, stitched with invisible thread, is the defiance of a rebellious teenager who embroidered a fox onto a cushion when her governess wasn't looking. Your pillow remembers them all. One well-known fact: embroidered pillows were never just decoration. They were archives of feeling, miniature memoirs. And the more you slept on them, the more they seemed to listen. Obscure detail? Some families passed their favorite pillows down through generations, not because they were valuable, but because they had rested well. A blessing of sorts. As if each night's sleep left behind a kindness, a softness, promise. There's one such heirloom in a farmhouse in Wales, a lumpy cushion with a faded red vine stitched in a circle. When asked what it meant, the great-granddaughter of its original maker simply replied, "It meant you could cry there. Not a rule, not a lecture, just permission." And maybe that's what this whole story was. Permission to rest, to feel, to remember. Tonight, you don't have to be a seamstress or a scholar. You don't have to know what a French knot is or how to split floss 6 ways. You don't need Latin inscriptions or imported velvet. You just need breath and a little stillness and the knowledge that somewhere long ago, someone stitched a piece of themselves into fabric not to impress or instruct, but simply to say, "I was here. I felt this. And it mattered." So take that in now. as your thoughts quiet, as your limbs grow heavier. Let the thread carry you home. Let the cushion remember for you. Let the story dissolve not into an ending, but into a whisper, a warmth, a peace. And so our journey for tonight comes to a close. But the echoes of history don't vanish with the silence. They linger, in the hush between breaths, in the soft hum beneath your thoughts, in the stories that settle into your dreams like dust on an old manuscript. The embroidered pillows of the past were never just cushions. They were letters without envelopes, songs without sound, little shrines of memory tucked beneath heads and behind hearts. And as you drift now, slowly, sweetly, you carry that softness with you. The world is full of noise, urgency, and bright lights. But here, under this blanket of forgotten thread and slow storytelling, you are exactly where you're meant to be. If you enjoy this quiet corner of the past, don't forget to like, subscribe, and maybe leave a comment with where in the world you're listening from and what time it is there. There's something deeply comforting about knowing people all over the globe are drifting off together, wrapped in the same ancient tale. I'll be right here next time, waiting in the candlelight, ready to turn another page of forgotten history just for you. Until then, let the stars above keep watch.